In this lesson, we're going to look at the different parts of the brain. First of all, I want to mention there are three specific brain regions. The first, the hindbrain, which you see in the diagram, is represented at the base in pink. The hindbrain is sometimes called the old brain. If you believe in evolution, it would have been the first part of the brain to evolve, sometimes referred to as the brain stem. The hindbrain is the only part of the brain that you could not live without. You could remove the midbrain and the forebrain and you'd still be alive. However, you would basically be a vegetable. The hindbrain overall task is to deal with vital functions. The second part, the midbrain, which is represented on the diagram in green, also called the limbic system. This is the emotional part of your brain and also contains the part of the brain that deals with semantic memories. The third division of the brain, the forebrain, is represented in orange on the diagram. This is the largest portion of the brain. It's the gray matter that you would see if you looked at a diagram. The forebrain is sometimes called the cerebrum or cerebral cortex. The forebrain is responsible for your higher mental thoughts. First, we are going to look at the different parts of the hindbrain. The medulla sits at the bottom or the base of the brain and connects to the spine. The medulla is responsible for your heartbeat and your breathing. The thalamus is responsible for receiving sensory input or sensory impulses and then sending them where they need to go for processing and interpretation in the forebrain or cerebral cortex. This is like a switchboard operator. An operator receives a call and then transmits the call to the correct person or location that it needs to go in the building. This is true for all of your senses except for smell. Smell bypasses the thalamus and goes directly to the forebrain. The next part of the hindbrain is the reticular formation. The reticular formation deals with arousal, and this is like your level of alertness. In animal studies with cats, it was shown that if the reticular formation is electrically stimulated, which basically causes with an electrode this part of the brain to be active, we found that a cat was very overstimulated, very overly aroused. And then if this part of the brain was lesioned, a cat would just slip into a coma, never to be aroused again. Lesion would mean damage, destroy, or remove that part of the brain. Another part of the hindbrain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum sits at the base in the back of the brain, at the very bottom, tucked neatly up under the skull. The cerebellum is sometimes called a little brain because it looks like a little miniature brain. The cerebellum controls your voluntary movement and balance. So if this part of the brain were to be damaged, we would find it difficult to walk across the room or maintain a sitting position. As we'll learn when we talk about memory, the cerebellum is also active in processing memories that involve skills or procedures, which makes sense since that would involve movement. The last part of the hindbrain is referred to as the pons. The pons are very active when we are asleep and dreaming. So we'll look at the activation synthesis theory in an upcoming lesson when we talk about the different dream theories. There's also a part of the pons that involves facial recognition. If this region of the brain was damaged, we would find it difficult to recognize other people's faces. The pons also work with other parts of the brain and help coordinate movement. The second region that we need to look at is the limbic system or midbrain. This is your emotional and memory center. The first part of the limbic system is the amygdala. The amygdala is linked to anger and fear. Again, with animal studies, they were able to uncover how this affected our behavior. In using cats, they electrically stimulated this area. And as you can see, the electrode in the left picture there would make this part of the brain active. When this part of the brain was activated in a cat's brain, it became very angry and started to pounce and attack anything that came near it. On the other hand, they also destroyed or lesioned this part of the brain in rhesus monkeys. Rhesus monkeys are normally very aggressive. However, When they remove this part of the brain, they cower in fear at anything that comes near them. That is how they figured out that the amygdala is associated with fear and anger. The hypothalamus pretty much regulates everything that's hormonal. The hypothalamus tells the master gland or the pituitary gland when to release their hormones. Therefore, it regulates things like thirst, body temperature, emotions, sex drive, growth, and hunger. When looking at how hunger is impacted through the hypothalamus, we look at the fat rat experiment, which we'll talk about again in a future chapter. Whenever a certain part of the hypothalamus is activated, a rat will just eat and eat and eat and eat until its heart gives out, as long as food is presented. There's another part of the hypothalamus. If it is lesioned, a starving rat will refuse to eat. The hippocampus involves your memory, specifically your semantic memory or episodic memory. This is where we process names, facts, dates, or events that have occurred in our lives. The third region of the brain is the forebrain, or the cerebral cortex, or cerebrum. Again, your forebrain or cerebral cortex is involved in higher mental processes, which we will look at. There are four main lobes to the forebrain or cerebral cortex: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. You have a left hemisphere with four main lobes, and then you also have a right hemisphere with four main lobes. The cerebral cortex contains fissures. It's like neatly coiled inside of the brain so that it can take a large mass and fit neatly in your skull. If you were to unravel the cerebral cortex, it would be roughly the size of a big, giant challenge pizza. However, it's neatly coiled in these fissures, which allow it to fit in a small space inside of the skull. Think of a ball of yarn. If you unravel a ball of yarn and throw it down a hallway, it looks quite long, but you can roll it up into a little ball and fit it neatly inside your fist. The frontal lobe is a lobe of the forebrain or cerebral cortex that sits in front of the head, just above the forehead. Your frontal lobe is responsible for planning, judgment, abstract thought, decision-making, and other higher mental processes. The frontal lobe contains a motor cortex, which is represented in pink on the diagram. This motor cortex has been completely mapped out by scientists. Scientists know exactly which part of the motor cortex coordinates with the different body parts. So if you electrically stimulated the motor cortex region for your pinky would move. The frontal lobe also contains the Broca's area. This is an area in the left hemisphere only that is involved in speech. Paul Broca was a physician working with stroke victims, and he noticed when this region of the brain was damaged, his victims lost the ability to move the muscles in their mouth and learn to speak. Therefore, this area of the brain was named after him. The parietal lobe sits directly behind the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe processes spatial reasoning, logical thought, mathematical equations. But it also contains the sensory cortex, which you can see highlighted in a lighter shade of blue on the diagram. The sensory cortex, or somatosensory cortex, sits directly behind the motor cortex. And just like the motor cortex, scientists have completely mapped out the somatosensory cortex. They know exactly what region of this cortex coordinates to different body parts. So if you electrically stimulate the sensory cortex for the region of your pinky, you would feel like someone is touching your pinky. The occipital lobe sits in the back of the brain. This is the smallest lobe, and it is responsible for processing vision. The temporal lobe sits on the sides, right above your ears, and not surprising, this is responsible for what you hear. It contains your auditory cortex, so it processes sound. There's also parts of the auditory cortex that are the temporal lobe, that is responsible for facial recognition. So if certain regions of the temporal lobe would be damaged, you would lose the ability to recognize some people's faces. The temporal lobe in the left hemisphere only, once again, contains what's called the Wernicke's area. Again, a physician working with stroke victims, his name was Carl Wernicke. He recognized when his victims had this part of their brain damaged, they lost the ability to understand language. They could still speak, but they could not understand what anyone was saying to them. It would be like sitting in a room and everyone was talking in a foreign language. In the previous slides, I mentioned the Broca's area, which involves the muscle movement of your mouth and allows you to speak, and the Wernicke's area, which allows you to understand what someone is saying. If either of those areas are damaged, we would say aphasia has occurred. Aphasia is simply an impairment of language. And finally, the association areas would be the areas represented in gray. Association areas involve all parts of the forebrain or cerebral cortex not involved in motor movement or sensation. So the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, the auditory and visual cortexes. This would be everything else other than those regions. This is involved in all of your higher mental functionings, as we said, such as learning, memory, thinking, communicating, making judgment, planning. The more association areas in the brain, the smarter the species. After all, if you look at a rat's brain or a cat's brain, their association areas aren't very large. They don't have to plan where they're going to go on vacation.